I'm going to go through another example of splitting up an expression and identifying the terms, the variables, the coefficients, and the factors. Okay? On Khan Academy, they go through some different types of examples, and I want to talk about that before you do it. Before we talk about that, though, I want to talk about the multiplication sign. Okay? The multiplication sign changes when we talk about expressions and equations. Okay, and the reason why it changes is because you would typically see 3 times 2. Okay, 3 times 2 would equal 6. Okay, but when we're in it talking about expressions and using equations, we're not sure if this x is a variable or if it's a multiplication sign. So how we show multiplication in algebra and when we write expressions and equations changes a little bit. Okay, because let's say we didn't know what 2 was. Okay, well, we're going to use a variable to represent this number. So I'm going to erase this number and I'm going to put a variable in there. Well, variables could be x, they could be y, they could be z, they could be something else like a symbol, or you could put a smiley face, okay? Variables could be anything, any symbols, but most commonly they are a letter, and the most common letter used is an x, okay? So if we had the times, 3 times, a number that we wanted to represent with a variable, okay, and we chose the letter x, this looks like 3 times times, or 3xx. It becomes very difficult to understand what the problem is asking. So the multiplication sign gets changed. Okay? One way that you can change this multiplication sign is just put what looks like a decimal number, or excuse me, a decimal, but we just raise it up a little bit and put it right in the middle, and we put the x. So this says 3 times x. Another way that you can represent multiplication is when you put the variable in parentheses. Okay? So this says 3 times x. The other way that you'll see multiplication represented is when the letter is just right next to the number. Okay? And we talked about this before in a previous video, because when you see this in a term, this term, if this was a term in an expression, which it is an expression, this term has 2 factors, 3 and x. Just like this term has 2 factors, this term has 2 factors, and this term has 2 factors. Okay? Because if we were to plug a number in for x, we would multiply those numbers. Okay? Because this represents multiplication. So when you are writing multiplication, when you are writing expressions, we no longer want to use the x for the multiplication. Okay? We don't want to represent it this way because that gets confusing. So we have the decimal that we raise up a little bit. It looks like a decimal or a dot. We have the parenthesis, and we go nothing in between it. Those are the 3 ways that we represent multiplication now. Okay? Now, with that being said, let's identify the terms, coefficients, variables, and factors in this expression. Okay? What's different about this expression and what you'll see on Khan Academy is this expression has parentheses. Okay? So you have to evaluate the expression as a whole, and then you have to evaluate the inside of the parentheses. So what you're going to do is you're going to evaluate the expression as a whole. So I'm going to look at this entire expression, and I'm going to find the plus and minus signs. Pretend like anything inside the parentheses is off limits. So if I find a plus sign in the parentheses right now, I'm not going to do anything with it. Okay? So, for example, this plus sign is in the parentheses, so I'm just going to skip it for now. This plus sign is in the parentheses, so I'm going to skip it for now. But this is outside it. So I'm going to put a line. Okay, I'm going to change that to a different color. Okay. So this expression, this entire expression, has two terms. Okay? This is one big term. This is one term. Okay, but there's two terms in the entire expression. Now, if we look at each term individually, this term is very interesting because there's two sets of parentheses and they're right next to each other. Okay, we just talked about parentheses with multiplication. One thing that I forgot to say is that you could also have represented it with both of them, the 3 and the x, in parentheses. So why don't you add that to your notes? Okay, this is another way to represent multiplication. Okay, anything inside this parenthesis is going to get multiplied by anything inside this parenthesis. So this example here, these parentheses are multiplied by these parentheses. So this whole thing is a factor. Okay, this whole thing is a factor. Now, if we look inside the factor, we can split that expression. There's actually an expression inside the expression. Okay, so we look at this expression inside this set of parentheses. Okay, if we took that out and just wrote it all by itself, we can identify the parts to that expression. Okay, so I'm going to identify the parts to this. Well, I can split it up into two terms. Okay, and each of these is a factor. Each of these is a factor. Put little f's by them. Okay, each of those is a factor. What else does that have? Well, it has variables. Okay, this x is a variable. This y is a variable. Okay? If you look at the other set, so inside this was a term and this was a term because it's split up. There's two terms inside that parenthesis. Same thing over here. Split this up here. This is a term, this is a term. This is a factor because it's right next to the variable. Okay? A number right next to a variable means multiplication. So both of these are factors. Okay? This is just a constant, so we don't need to mark it. Okay? The last thing are coefficients. How many coefficients are in this entire expression? Coefficients are constant numbers in front of a variable in an expression. So if you look at this 3 is a coefficient. This 2 is a coefficient. This 5 is a coefficient. And there are no more. The reason that those 3 are coefficients is because they're a number right in front of a variable. A number right in front of a variable. A number right in front of a variable. Okay? So that's there's a lot going on here, okay? And you're probably going to have to watch this more than one time to understand it really well, okay? But variables, coefficients, factors, terms. Those are things that you need to know how to use really well. Okay, and probably the hardest one to understand is factors, especially when there are parentheses within the expression. Okay, over here, this term, it's just a constant number all by itself, so there's no coefficient, it's not considered a factor, it's just considered a constant, and there's no variable that's on here, so that's just a term all by itself. Okay?